And hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. I am your host, Marshall, and I am just finalizing one last little detail there. So now we're good to go. And I am here to talk to you today about moral dilemmas in Kriegsspiel. Now, what the heck, right? Yesterday, I played this really cool game uh, with Otto and a bunch of other members. It was an Eastern Front World War II campaign. I was playing as the Soviets, and we basically had to hold out against a German attack. So the baddies were coming this way, and I know they're the baddies because they had skulls on their caps. Let's just change this here. So the baddies were coming up this way, more or less, and this was their objective, and my goal was to hold that objective. And I chose a nice little defense in depth. And this is just backstory here. I'm going to explain why this is relevant. But I deployed here. I had an ambush set up here, and then I had the main line of resistance set up here. And it worked beautifully. It worked beautifully because as the enemy came, this way, they did a good job encircling and enveloping this and destroying it. But then as they came here, they were exposed to the ambush, and by the time they got here, they were largely spent. So it worked pretty well. We tired them out. It was a good time. It was a good battle. It was a great success. But there were several dilemmas that I faced, moral dilemmas that when you're playing a game, you don't think about moral dilemmas much, because you're just having fun. You're thinking about how do I beat the enemy? What mechanics can I use to, kind of throw a spanner in his works or ruin his plans and so on. And that's what you're thinking about. But in Kriegspiel, there's a little bit of a role play element to it. You're giving orders and receiving reports, and you're doing things as in character, I would say. And you can't help but wonder what would my character do. I had one particular occasion where I was standing right about here in this position here, and we were faced with what we thought was going to be an overwhelming attack. It turned out to never happen, but the enemy was basically arrayed here, and we were expecting them to attack and push through. And I'm looking at this road like it's a juicy steak, and it's Friday night, and I haven't eaten since breakfast. I am looking at this road as, I could just take off this way and I would not be captured. And all my guys, of course, would die fighting valiantly, allowing me to escape, my little old Soviet captain self. Um, the thought occurred to me because that's human. It's natural to have that thought. And I'm thinking, what do you do? On a couple of occasions, particularly down here, the order was essentially fight to the death. It was hold to the last man. And I told them, if you can get away, if you can break away and retreat and come back to this position, go ahead. But ultimately, you need to delay the enemy. And the commander wanted to ambush them, which I approved, and then any survivors of that were to fall back. But there was no expectation that this particular mission here, as the enemy came up this way and this way, was going to be an experience that these soldiers survived. They were either going to be killed or captured, and that's all there was to it. This force was completely written off, stricken from the records, deleted, not a factor. So, what do you do? Here I am, and I'm playing this game, and it's a game, I know, but I'm ordering people to, fight to the death kind of a thing. And it's like, what do you tell people? And I considered, and I spoke about this on the live stream, the quality of the troops. Let's say these are conscripts. Let's say these are young soldiers who are poorly educated. What do you tell them to get them to do what you want them to do, which is essentially fight to the death? The most famous instance of this order in history, of course, is oh gosh, I want to say what Mustafa Kemal or whatever. He was the Turkish commander in at Gallipoli, and he gave the order to his men. He said, "I am not ordering you to fight. I am ordering you to die." And wow, you know. And I thought about that, and I thought, What if I was a professional in the military, if I was an officer and I had to give a fight to the death order? What would I tell the troops under my command? So we assume that, look, we're all grown-ups here, we're all adults. Everybody who signed up to the Army, regardless of the circumstances of their enrollment, whether they were drafted or joined voluntarily, is aware that this is a hazardous profession and that you are taking odds on coming out alive or unscratched. And given that, wouldn't it be the respectful thing to tell people that you have to fight to the death and that you're not going to survive this encounter? Isn't that appropriate? Does that change the way the soldiers will fight? Or do you lie to them? Do you say, hey, I just need you guys to hold here for 1 hour. Relief is on the way. As long as you can hold this position, we're going to defeat the enemy. Whatever you say, whatever you feel they need to hear in order to hold that position. Now, that's a moral dilemma, right? Do you lie? And what lie do you tell if you lie? Or do you tell the truth and just expect that their natural sense of honor and patriotism, as well as a fear of shame, is sufficient to keep them engaged? And so I had to wrangle with this moral dilemma, completely self-contrived, mind you. I'm still playing a game. But that's the cool thing about this game is it inspires moral dilemmas. And the answer that I came to was you do whatever it takes to, execute the mission, right? So if the mission is hold, stop the enemy, whatever, and if I as the commander determine that a force needs to hold a position to the death, then I'm going to tell that force based on my understanding of its men what they need to hear to do what I need them to do, even if it's a lie. Because ultimately, the mission is the thing, right? When you're in an army, you're like an ant, right? You're one cell in a much larger organism, and you're no longer quite the individual. And a decision has been made that we will sacrifice some of these cells in order to preserve the whole of the organism. And this is simply the calculus. And it could just as easily be you in the trench on that front line as the person who you're giving commands to. In fact, tomorrow it could be you. The defenses could break, the enemy could come through somewhere else, and now you're the one that's being ordered to fight to the death. So, look, it's fair, folks. It's cricket. It's fair. So, at the end of the day, you tell the people what you need to tell them to hear in order for them to do the job they need to do. Now, I would imagine that, look, if I was an officer in a professional military, let's say it's the United States military, I'm familiar with that. And the United States military is quite professional, probably the most professional military on the planet. And in a case like that, even if I am dealing with young men, I'd probably be more inclined to be honest with them because of that sense of professionalism. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if I feel that my units are unreliable, if I don't think that they will hold, if the fear grips them too hard, then I'm going to lie to them, you know, because the mission's the key. So this was a moral dilemma that I encountered, and um, it was a self-contrived moral dilemma because at the end of the day, I'm playing a game, right? But what is the role of moral dilemmas in Kriegsspiel? Remember our history, right? Kriegsspiel was developed as a training exercise. It was also used to war game and simulate things and to teach and everything else. But fundamentally, it became a training exercise. It was preparation training for war. And as a result, one of the things that a professor would reasonably do or a commander would reasonably do to their officers is put them into a moral dilemma. The most famous moral dilemma that everybody knows about is completely fictional, right? It's the Kobayashi Maru, which is in Star Trek. If you watch Star Trek, Captain Kirk is put into a no-win situation, and he has to beat that situation. And it actually comes up in, I think, the second movie, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which is the best of the Star Trek movies, by the way. And it also comes up in kind of the new Star Trek universe where he actually takes the test. So if you're interested in that, absolutely, just search up Kobayashi Maru and you'll learn about it. Um, I don't want to give any spoilers, of course, but in that test, he faced a moral dilemma. Do I do the right thing, which is help people who are in need, even though it violates orders? Or do I violate the orders and allow people who are in need to die? So I have a moral dilemma, you know. Do I allow innocent people to die because I chose to strictly adhere to my orders, or do I intervene? It's kind of like the trolley problem, only in space. And moral dilemmas are exceedingly relevant in military training. But what about in gaming? I think they add another layer to the gaming experience. So one of the cool things about playing Kriegsspiel, and this is why I like the role playing aspect, is you actually learn a lot about yourself. I've learned a lot about myself, particularly doing the role playing side of Kriegsspiel campaigns, and it's very insightful. I've learned a lot more about my moral character. What would I really do in a certain situation? Now, we would all like to assume, and we tell ourselves these lies, that I would do a certain thing. I would hold here to the last. When in reality, I'd probably take off and run away, right? We all tell ourselves stories about how we want to be or how we want to be perceived or how we feel we would do. We have fantasies, but we also know there's a reality. Now, we don't have to share these details with anyone else, but I think it's important to have this internal conversation with yourself and say, what would I do if I were put in this situation? If I were told to hold to the last? If I were told to fire indiscriminately on a civilian population or a civilian center? Do I open fire? How far do I take my obedience to the orders? What do I do in this situation? And it's okay to say in the game, I will do the right thing, but in reality, in the back of your head, I don't know if I would. As long as you have that honest conversation with yourself, I think you're making progress. And Kriegspiel is doing what it's supposed to do, which is to help you to learn and understand more about yourself. And if you know that you would be morally ambiguous or weak in a certain situation, well, the smart thing is avoid the potential to be in a situation like that. Remove yourself from the equation. Decline, avoid the area, whatever it may be in your life, so that you avoid those circumstances. But you are able to do that because you've war gamed a similar scenario, a congruent scenario. You've played it out in your head, and now you know how you will be in a certain situation. What if you're on the Titanic and it's going down? Do you put on a dress and a wig and pick up a baby and pretend to be a woman with a child? What do you do? You know, I mean, or do you sit there and go down with the ship, like, dress up in your finest suit and have a brandy as the water comes up to meet you? What do you do? I think it's important to kind of role play these things out, and Kriegspiel provides an environment where you can safely do so. It also provides a situation where you get caught up in a chain of command, where you have an authority that's ordering you to do something and where you have to order others beneath you to do something. In addition, you have peers on either side of you that gives you the presence of peer pressure. And all of these things exist in real life. So Kriegspiel is a fantastic training ground or test bed for that. So it's more than a game. If we're playing just a standard hex encounter game with the rule book, I bust out my GMT games rule book and I'm going to move my block or whatever here or here or my little markers here or here, and we're going to check the die roll modifiers on the combat results table we're going to roll, and oh, I got to flip this counter over, it took a loss, big deal. There's no room for moral dilemmas in that game, and I think that's because the designers are probably uncomfortable with it. But Kriegspiel is this unique, magical place where we have incredible flexibility to do and recreate whatever dilemma and scenario we want, and it's just perfect for that purpose. All right, let's take a look here at some comments. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with me, but we're only 15 minutes in. But let's see what we got. Gobbler said, just finished watching the March on the Rhine AAR. Extremely relevant topic. Yes. Achilles agrees. Achilles says, the answer to this question is, I think, very heavily determined by the army you're in. Japan in World War II, USSR, etc., would have had a different answer than an American or British force. By the way, hello to Jan, who's also saying hello. Um, yeah, I agree. If you're in the Japanese army, you would tell your soldiers, yeah, we're fighting to the last man, because there is this cultural idea, or this idea that's been instilled into you that harks back to the days of Bushido, which was part of Japanese military culture at that time period. That, hey, you are basically like the old samurai, and of course you're not a samurai at all, but you make the soldiers feel like they're in that role, and that they have to uphold that particular standard, and that means fighting to the death. If you're Soviet and you're a bunch of conscripts, you could appeal to their patriotism, you could appeal to a number of things to get them to do what you want them to do. But ultimately, you probably also need, blocking units with machine guns, which they had for a year or two during the war, early on, mostly to kind of enforce and instill discipline, and to get the people to do what they wanted to do. So there was a certain fear-based motivation that was exercised in the USSR, and I'm sure they also probably just lied to the troops as well. Again, because of the quality of the soldiers and their absolute lack of training. Many soldiers early in the war were taught only how to march. Dress in their uniform and fire their weapon, and that's it. They really were not given any proper training and tactics. It was really just trial by fire, especially early on. American or British, uh, I would like to think that we would be honest with our soldiers and expect a certain degree of professionalism out of them. But again, American and British forces, particularly American, you had a wide range of experience levels, right? You had experienced elite soldiers who were highly trained and motivated, which was a small number of the forces. Then you had the rank and file soldier who was planning on going home and marrying his high school sweetheart, you know, and you got to deal with that. So, yeah, that's a thing. Jan, also known as Let's Play History, which, by the way, check out his YouTube channel, Let's Play History, says, I think we should take some inspiration from board games that have pushed the boundaries of what is being covered in conflict simulations. Okay, I agree. There are board games out there that put you into a moral dilemma as part of the game. Um, we've talked long and hard, for example, about disaster Kriegsspiel. And one of the things that you have to do in disaster Kriegsspiel is determine, how do I allocate resources? Do I send first responders to the school, which is partially collapsed, or do I send them to the hospital, which is on fire, or what do I do? Um, there's this, either or kind of dilemma thing. The problem with this is that ultimately, at the end of the day, it distills down to a mechanic, and the player's going to do what gives them the most victory points ultimately in the calculus of the scenario, if it's that kind of a game. If it's a more open-ended role play heavy game where it's about training or whatever, then absolutely, that's like a Kriegsspiel. And that's what we do with Kriegsspiel. Kriegsspiel is open-ended. It's not about scoring victory points. In fact, it's common that players get done and they're like, well, who won? Who won? And umpires are typically nice and will say, well, I'm declaring this a victory for one side or the other side. But we all know in reality that's not always the case. In fact, a week ago, I ran the Easter Rising campaign, and I very cleverly did not say who won that campaign. And I don't know if anyone actually even asked. I think somebody asked after the fact, but I didn't tell the players that one side or another won, because that wasn't what it was about. For the Irish, it was about resource management and contending with an overwhelming force that was ultimately going to crush them. And for the British, it was about, resolving this conflict as quickly as possible with minimum losses. And what do you do, but again, it's a fertile ground for moral decision making and helping players to learn more about themselves. If I were to answer that question today, who won, I would say the players won if they learned something about themselves, or if they learned a lesson that they can keep and carry with them, especially apply to real life. I think that's a win. And that's another cool thing about Kriegsspiel, right? When you play a hex encounter war game, whoever has the most victory points at the end wins the game. Not so in Kriegsspiel. I'm running a tournament right now, and I am awarding points for good decisions that players make, but I have not told them what the rubric is. I'm not telling them how they score points because I don't want them to focus on that. I want them to focus on making the right decisions with limited information. And those that do the best will receive points, and those who do not, well, they could lose points even. Ultimately, the winner, though, is the one who learns more about themselves, regardless of the final state on the battlefield, because this is training. If this were real life, the winner would be the one who's still standing at the end of the battle. It doesn't matter about learning about yourself. In battle, that's not the place to learn about yourself. I mean, we could sit there, we can watch the Thin Red Line, great movie, by the way, and think about war and our nature and our place in it and learn about ourselves. Whatever, we can be as philosophical as we like, but in actual war, that's not the school, that's the test, that's the final exam, and it's do or die. That's why we have Kriegspiel, because it serves as a test bed, as a teaching experience, as a classroom where we can ask these questions and learn about ourselves, and then we take those lessons into the real life. Let's take a couple more comments here. Achilles says, yes, I agree. The boundaries on these things are being stretched in the board game world by some designers. And I think that's a positive movement. And yes, I really do think we should get away from games that have winners. No more winners. Let's get away from the whole idea of competition and winning. Let's make the competition against you yourself. You win if you learn something about yourself. More games should be that way. Why do games always have to have a victory point track? You know, no. Let's start to reframe some of these experiences. How many times have you sat down and you played a game, even a nice game like a Euro game, and you just had an amazing time? You had so much fun. You don't care who won. Winning was just uh, what we would call in the Hollywood industry a MacGuffin. It's just a motivator, a thing that moves the story along. It's not even a real thing. It's just a mechanic that moves the story along. That's called a MacGuffin. It's like the briefcase in Pulp Fiction. Nobody knows what the heck was in the briefcase. The answer is nothing. It was a light. It's nothing. It was a MacGuffin to move the story along. Same thing with a game. The whole idea of a winner is just to get everybody together at a table to play a game. But the real winner is the person who has the experience and feels entertained by it. And why can it then also be the real winner is the person who has a positive experience? Okay, one more comment here from Jan says, I am of the opinion that a game can portray any topic really. It comes down to framing and carefully deciding which aspects the players should have agency on and which not. And I agree. I thoroughly agree that it comes down to making those key decisions as a designer. All right. I said everything I feel I need to say. I don't see the need to prattle on, but I would like to invite anybody from the audience. I've got 8 people down in the audience who would like to share some insight or ask a question. Raise your hand and I will promote you to the stage and you can talk. So, what questions do you have? I don't see any questions, but I see a couple people here who I would like to hear from, I gotta say. Lord Hugs, by the way, joined the military, and I'm sure he's had some kind of training. I bet you he would have some insight. Um, I wouldn't mind hearing from him. And Achilles, of course. Achilles, I don't know if he wants to talk. I'm not going to make anyone talk, but I'm just saying that some of you, I think, have some gems that you could share. Okay, there's Achilles. There you go. All right. You've been invited to speak, sir. There you are. Go ahead, Achilles.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Achilles.
Uh,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I was just thinking about particularly the the way you started out, and some of the questions on the moral dilemmas. I think one of the ones that comes up more often in Kriegsspiel is the dealing with civilians and the dealing with prisoners
Mhm.
is one of the more common ones that we face. And also, of course, the just the thought that you know nothing can truly be a simulation. You
Yeah,
don't know how you will react or respond uh, to it until you're actually in it. Nobody knows how they're gonna respond to combat until they get into combat. Um,
but
or
that's why
for
you
that,
have training. That's why you have training,
yes,
though. Yeah,
yeah, precisely. And if your training is good, um, it tends to kick in. I know, at least as from personal experience, that was my experience. And then everything just kind of everything outside of that becomes a blur. It's the way the human mind works. You filter out the non-essential, and and you just start doing everything as if you were as if you almost as if you were an automaton, and you don't really experience it until afterwards.
right.
And that's when your hands start to shake.
I can imagine. I
You know,
can
it's
imagine.
you know, my best example of that, I think, is it's like if you were in a car accident,
Mhm.
or nearly in a car accident, and you know that moment. I mean, most of us have experienced this at some time or another if we've driven a car,
Yeah,
um, where you know, in the moment that it was happening, everything seems to be kind of almost almost slow motion, uh,
yeah.
and you react to the situation. It's not until afterwards when you're standing around looking at the your car, or you are in the ditch and you're like, oh my god, you know, I could have been killed here. That's the moment when your hands start to shake, right? I mean,
Right.
that's when it hits you what just happened, you know.
Yeah,
Is a very similar kind of experience, at least for me, but everybody's experience of it is kind of personal.
yeah.
um as for the moral dilemma of how to deal with civilians, how to deal with prisoners, like Hugs could probably speak to this. I'm not sure what they go over in basic anymore, but we had you know, they there's an instilling of the idea of, you know, following the ROE, the rules of engagement, uh, what the rules are for how you treat a prisoner, um, what your rights are as a prisoner. Those are all things that, as an American, we expect to be respected. But if you're in a different culture, a different time, different army, that's not necessarily the case. They have a
Mhm.
total different expectation, and you know it's that in fact that impacts it as well. I mean, what their goal is in that sense. But we had a training exercise I can remember in command school that where we dealt with a situation where you were under tremendous pressure, and you know, you had some prisoners, and then suddenly you were under attack, and the question, you know, could you spare the men to guard the prisoners and still defend from the attack,
Mhm.
which, you know, was overwhelming. And then what do you do? You know, is your instinct to, okay, well, we got to get rid of these prisoners, and then you just eliminate them?
Mhm.
Okay, you've just violated any number of rules. And if you give that order, and in the case of this exercise, the commanding officer gave that order
Mhm.
because the test was, would you carry it out?
Mhm.
And of course, under our rules for the U.S. Army, you are not supposed to carry out an illegal order. And that
Right.
would be an illegal order. So we do have limits on what can be ordered.
Mhm. Mhm.
And even down to the lowliest private, he has agency here. He can say no. You know, this, I consider this illegal and immoral, and I'm not going to carry this order out. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
um, but then you think of somebody like William Calley in Vietnam. You
Right.
know,
Neeli.
yeah,
Yeah.
uh, you know, his guys were more than willing. Most of them were more than willing to carry it out. You know,
Yeah.
and that's kind of why it's after that, it's post that particular particularly in the 80s and 90s when they started to kind of stress that in training a little more because they did not want repeats of that situation. But, you know, they were on a very small scale. We had some repetitions of that, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, on a much smaller scale. But it did happen because not everybody that goes into uniform is a perfect human being.
Right.
Uh, they're not all, honor bound soldiers. Some of them are guys that you wouldn't trust to wash your car, much less
Yeah.
anything else, and you certainly wouldn't trust them with a gun, and yet there they are,
Yeah.
so you don't march off to war with all perfect soldiers. I think there's a paraphrasing of Henry V right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there you go. And this is where I think Kriegsspiel can help us as individuals, even as amateurs who are just playing a game to have some fun. If you're not getting insight about yourself and your moral character from Kriegsspiel, I would say get more into it and get
Yeah,
into some of the role play simulations. And if you don't like what you learn about yourself, that's okay. That's a win, because then once you're aware that I have this preference or this tendency to react a certain way, maybe that's something I can work on.
yeah,
Whereas if you never explore that, you never know until you're in that situation and you do the thing that you will later regret for the rest of your life, or that will get you killed. And you
mhm.
don't want that. So I think it's really important, and this is why we play Kriegspiel.
I think you're dead on in that, and the practice of it, as you mentioned before, you rely on your training when you're put into a situation where you would normally, under normal circumstances, you wouldn't know what to do. Most people freeze. It's like
Yeah.
they talk about the good guy with the gun versus the bad guy with the gun. The reality is that once somebody just starts shooting out of nowhere, you're not prepared for it. Most people will freeze in that situation unless
Hmm.
you are trained. You know,
Hmm.
it's at that moment the training kicks in. Well, Kriegspiel in this respect is a kind of training, and character can be built.
Hmm.
In my opinion, and I have to stress that it is my opinion that I think character can be exercised the same way you exercise your muscles. Um, as a training thing, I remember when I was teaching, I told my kids, try today when you go to lunch, ref- don't have the dessert. You really love the chocolate cake today, don't do it.
Hmm.
Just don't do it simply on the principle that I am stronger than the chocolate cake. I can say no.
Well,
Yeah. And
and
those
you'll see me sitting
moments
there with six chocolate cakes at the table. The other
I'm gonna
kids have gone off.
declare
I'm still eating.
see, that's that's a small thing, but
Hmm.
it's those kinds of moments where you build character,
Right.
where you develop the will to make the decision, to build the character. Um, and I believe that is effective. I believe that that's true. And if you do that consistently, you can build a sense of character. And through training exercises and in Kriegspiel, the repetition of of reacting to situations develops that ability to, when the time comes, you don't have to think, you can just act because you've already done it a
You've done
thousand
the
times
homework.
in your yes, you've already done it a thousand times. So you just react to it.
Yeah.
You know how to react to it. Last example, and this is just a physical one. Um, there's something called an adrenaline dump that
Hmm.
occurs when you're in a that kind of situation, combat, say a combat situation, and it heightens all of your senses and everything else, but it also completely destroys your motor skills. Okay,
Hmm.
because you have all this adrenaline surging through your hands, or your fingers feel like they're three times the size of normal, and you can't do fine mechanical things. Like, for example, if your weapon jams, try manipulating it when your hands feel like they're three times bigger. It's really difficult to do. One of the ways they simulate this for training is, and this is on a more advanced level of tactical training, um, you sprint 100 yards, pick up a weapon that's on a table, load it, charge it, and fire. And you have X amount of time to do it and hit the target.
Hmm.
And the sprint causes your body's physiology to react in a very similar way to what happens with the adrenaline dump. And so the first time you do it, you sprint to that, right, and you find it really difficult to pick it up and put the magazine in and charge it and then aim properly because your
Hmm.
breathing is all over the place, and and then actually hit the target. So you do it repeatedly, though, you get used to how your body reacts to that, and also of course the techniques of slowing down your breathing and all these other things. So you do it over and over again so that when the moment actually happens, you will it'll kick in instantly, and you'll just know how to react to it and respond to it.
Right.
Anyway, that's a physical example of the same thing, but I think it works for all of these things across the board. I think it's a very similar kind of process.
Yeah, and like you point out, that was a physical example, whereas Kriegsspiel allows us to exercise the mental or moral
Precisely,
side of it,
precisely.
which I think is really, really important. So there we have it, folks. Oh, Lord Hugs wants to speak. Let's go ahead and invite him. And there you go.
Somebody
Oh,
put on the PG filter.
I know, right?
no, 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 no. No, I was just listening, and I'll be real quick, but I do think that Kriegsspiel, in the context of like actual training, um, is a little limited. If we're talking about like morality and stuff like that, I think
Hmm.
Kriegsspiel is great for putting together theory. But I don't really think you can really go through a lot of these emotions without doing practical exercises like what Achilles is
Hmm.
describing. I think Kriegspiel is way better for more theory based things and putting together. Well, in this situation, it would probably be best to do X, but then when you actually get put into that situation, you might end up doing Y.
Right,
So
right.
Yeah, I
And
don't disagree. I think the two complement each other. That you know you do the mental exercises and you do it's building a foundation. But I agree with him. You still don't know until you do it, and
right. Well, you have the kiddie pool, that's about a foot deep. You have
Mhm.
the swimming pool, and then you have the ocean. And Creekspill's probably the kiddie pool, and basic training or advanced training is the swimming pool, and then real life is the ocean. But those experiences are all valid. So being exposed to the kiddie pool as a little kid helps you to condition you to prepare you to take on the swimming pool later, where then you build upon that. So I think we're all correct here, and you're right. I think it's an important point that there are stages to this, there are levels to this, and
Mhm.
Kriegspiel is down there at that bottom level. The problem is I think a lot of people don't even step into the kiddie pool, they don't even get their feet wet, and then they end up in the ocean one day, and well, what do you do? So that's the problem, and that's where why, again, I think this has incredible value. It may just be getting your feet wet, but that's you're a lap ahead of everyone else who's still sitting on the couch in that case.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point there. Many people never get even close to testing it. You
Yeah,
know, they never even get close to. They don't get into situations where they even have to, you know, do the introspection.
yeah, but they
You know,
own firearms and they post a lot on Facebook. They post a lot on Facebook. Try that with me,
Are
punk.
you talking about my uncle?
Right, right. Bubba. I'm talking about Bubba. Who
Hmm.
sits in his big truck with the sunglasses, telling you how he's going to school everyone who disagrees
Oh
with
yeah,
him.
that's right.
Let's try it, Bubba.
but looping back to the you mentioned prisoners award stuff like that. I'd be really
Hmm.
interested in doing this conversation again, like here in about a year, maybe year and a half, because actually that's going to be directly involved in my job.
Mm.
Yes,
So
yes, it will.
so I
Yeah.
I will be really glad to revisit that conversation at a later date.
No
Good.
problem.
Welcome
Anytime, man.
back. Let us know
You
when you're
know,
ready.
I'm there for you, Hugs. I'm there for you.
All right. Well, we've gone over time actually, which I think is great. I want to thank everyone for being here, being part of the show. In particular, Achilles and Lord Hugs, both guys with actual real life military experience. They've read a couple books, and they know perhaps better than any of us, how all of this fits together, as Lord Hugs very well pointed out. And again, we're playing in the kiddie pool, but I think we're still ahead of everybody else who's still sitting on the couch. So that's all I have for today. I want to thank you all for being here. And that's it. So we will